My parents and my younger brother's family went on a trip, leaving me at home to watch his 7-year-old daughter, who had been mute since birth. As soon as the door closed, the little girl looked at me and spoke in a perfect voice. "Auntie, don't drink the coffee Mom made. She planned it." My blood ran cold. Camila stood perfectly still, her brown eyes devoid of their usual childhood innocence. The silence of the Scarsdale house felt heavy and jagged, like broken glass. I stared at the porcelain mug on the granite island. Thin ribbons of steam curled upward, carrying the rich scent of French roast and something metallic. Brandy had handed it to me with a practiced porcelain smile before boarding the SUV. She called it a peace offering for my recent stress. My fingers hovered inches from the handle, trembling. Camila did not look away or blink. She looked like a soldier standing guard over a landmine. Her favorite stuffed bunny lay forgotten on the cold tile floor. Camila grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly iron-clad for a child. She led me toward the guest room, her footsteps silent on the hardwood. I stumbled behind her, my mind spinning with the impossibility of her voice. It was melodic, clear, and terrifyingly mature. She knelt by the bed and pried a loose baseboard away with a butter knife she'd hidden in her waistband. Behind the wood sat a plastic bag stuffed with folded papers. She handed them to me without a single word. The top sheet was a printed timeline in Brandy's neat, cursive script. It listed dates and doses of sedative compounds, designed to mimic early-onset dementia. My name was at the top of the page, circled in red ink. Below it lay a DNA test result with a 0% probability for my brother's paternity. Below it lay a DNA test result with a 0% probability for my brother's paternity. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Brandy wasn't just a sister-in-law. She was a shadow operative living in our guest room. Brandy wasn't just a sister-in-law. She was a shadow operative living in our guest room. She had everything to lose. I looked at the smoke detector in the corner of the ceiling. A tiny red light pulsed with rhythmic, mechanical malice. It wasn't a battery warning. It was a lens. Brandy was watching from the cruise ship, waiting for me to take that first, final sip. I realized then that every lapse in my memory over the last month had been manufactured. My freelance career was a crumbling ruin because of her chemistry. Camila watched the camera too. She knew the eyes in the walls were never closed. We had 4 days before the SUV rolled back into the driveway. I dumped the coffee into a glass jar and hid it deep in the trash. Then I grabbed a bottle of water and began to slur my words for the hidden microphone. I had to become the victim she expected to see. Camila sat back on the rug and picked up her crayons, returning to her mask of silence. We were no longer aunt and niece. We were two survivors waiting for the tide to turn. I moved toward the kitchen counter, swaying my hips like a woman losing her balance. I reached for the jar of vitamin powder Brandy had left behind. My goal was simple. I needed a pure sample for Roger to test. The camera lens watched me from the smoke detector, a tiny, unblinking red eye. I felt the heat of Camila's gaze from the hallway. She remained a statue. I deliberately knocked the open box over to create a mess. The white powder spilled across the black granite like fallen snow. I cursed under my breath, slurring the words just enough to satisfy the listener. My hands shook as I grabbed a paper towel to sweep the granules into a hidden vial. This was the primary obstacle. One wrong move would alert Brandy to my lucidity. I felt a cold sweat prickling my neck. The camera shifted slightly. It was a remote, controlled unit. Brandy was actively watching me right now. I finished the cleanup and retreated to the guest bathroom, locking the door with a loud click. Camila tapped a rhythmic code on the wood from the outside. I opened the small vial and smelled a faint, almond-like bitterness beneath the chalky scent. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an alert from my home security system. A secondary user had just logged into the smart locks from a maritime IP address. Brandy was testing the digital perimeter from the sea. I dialed Roger's private number, keeping my voice a low, raspy whisper. I told him I had the sample and needed a toxicology screen immediately. He sounded hesitant until I mentioned the memory gaps and the DNA test results. He agreed to meet me at the back fence in an hour. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. My eyes were bloodshot from the stress. I noticed a small blue pill tucked inside my toothbrush holder. This was the mid-scene turn I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the powder in the kitchen. Brandy was planting evidence in my personal items. I realized she was building a narrative for the police. If I died, it would look like a desperate, accidental overdose by a failing woman. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed the pill with a pair of tweezers. It was a high-dosage sedative. Brandy was thorough. She was already writing my suicide note. I met Roger at the edge of the property, where the maples blocked the camera's view. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and coming winter. I handed him the vial and the blue pill through the chain link fence. His face was a mask of professional concern as he tucked them away. He promised results by morning. I turned back toward the house, feeling the weight of the surveillance. Camila was waiting by the back door, holding my laptop case. She pointed to the screen, where a new email sat in the inbox. It was an automated notification from my bank. Someone had attempted to change the primary beneficiary on my retirement account 5 minutes ago. The request came from my own computer. I looked at the desk in the den. The mouse moved across the screen in a slow, ghostly drag. Brandy wasn't just watching me through the cameras. She had remote access to my entire digital life. I slammed the laptop shut to sever the remote connection. My heart hammered as I stared at the dark screen. I needed to block her access, without looking suspicious to the lens above. Camila tugged my sleeve, pointing toward the basement door. We descended into the humid, unfinished dark. My objective was the router. I had to throttle the upload speed to simulate a failing connection. If the video feed lagged, she might think the house had bad signal. The primary obstacle arrived as a sharp chime from the kitchen upstairs. My phone was ringing. The caller ID displayed Brandy's name. I froze near the humming fuse box. I couldn't ignore it twice. I took a deep breath and answered, pitching my voice into a thick, sleepy drawl. I complained about the internet flickering and my splitting headache. Brandy's voice was like honey over a razor blade. She told me to drink more water. I heard waves crashing. A mid-scene turn shifted the power when Camila handed me a tablet I hadn't seen before. It was logged into a secret cloud folder. I scrolled through photos of my own house, taken from the exterior. These weren't from today. They were from months ago. Someone had been stalking the perimeter long before the cruise began. I saw images of my trash cans and my car's odometer. The level of premeditated surveillance was chilling. Brandy had been studying my life. I felt a cold realization wash over me. Brandy wasn't working alone. The angles of the photos were too high for her height. Someone had used a drone or stood on a ladder near the oak trees. I whispered to Camila, asking if she saw anyone else. She nodded and traced a letter J in the dust on a crate. My brother, Justin. My chest tightened with a new, sharper betrayal. My own blood was helping her bury me in silence. I turned my attention back to the router, pulling a single wire loose to kill the external ports. The red eye upstairs would go dark now. I told Camila, we needed to find Justin's old laptop in the attic. If he was involved, his hardware might hold the encryption keys for the camera system. We climbed the creaking stairs, avoiding the soft spots in the wood. The air grew stale and hot. I felt like a ghost in my home. We reached the attic and found the dusty trunk. I pried the lock with a screwdriver. My knuckles white. Inside sat a silver laptop and a stack of burner phones. I powered the device on, the glow illuminating Camila's grim face. The desktop was covered in spreadsheets titled Inheritance. It mapped out my assets, my home value, and the family trust. They had a literal price tag on my life. Every cent was accounted for. This was a business plan. I scrolled down to the bottom of the final document. There was a scanned PDF of a life insurance policy I never signed. It was for $2 million, naming Brandy as the sole beneficiary. My forged signature stared back at me, perfect and terrifying. Suddenly, the burner phones in the trunk began to vibrate simultaneously. A text message appeared on the laptop screen from an unknown number. It read, "The camera is off. Why are you in the attic?" I shoved the burner phones back into the trunk, my skin crawling. The text message proved Brandy wasn't just watching a feed. Someone was physically near the property. My objective was to find that intruder without exposing our awareness. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the corner. Camila pointed to the small attic window. A silhouette moved near the detached garage. The pressure escalated as the back door creaked open. Someone was inside the house with us now. I moved to the landing, signaling for Camila to hide behind the heavy drapes. The footsteps were slow and rhythmic. This was the primary obstacle. I couldn't call the police yet without tipping off the maritime connection. I held my breath as a shadow crossed the hallway floor below. The air felt thin and cold. I gripped the poker until my knuckles ached. Then, a floorboard groaned. It wasn't Justin. The intruder was far taller and moved with military precision. The power balance shifted when I heard a familiar vibration. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a video call request from Brandy. I realized she was using the intruder to verify my state in real time. If I didn't answer, she would know the game was up. I had to perform. I stepped into the light of the hallway, swaying. I hit the accept button and squinted at the screen. Brandy's face appeared, framed by the dark ocean. "Angela, why aren't you in bed?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. I slurred a response about hearing a noise in the attic. I watched the intruder's shadow freeze against the wall, just out of the camera's view. It was a coordinated dance. She was directing him through her earpiece. I stumbled toward the kitchen, pretending to look for a glass of water. Brandy watched my every move. She told me to check the basement next. I think the heater is making that sound, she suggested smoothly. I knew what waited in the dark basement. The intruder moved toward the stairs, cutting off my exit. I noticed something on Brandy's screen then. She wasn't on the deck anymore. The background showed a beige wall and a fire extinguisher. She wasn't on a cruise ship. The maritime IP address was a spoofed location. Brandy was in a hotel less than 10 miles away from my house. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The 5-day cruise was a fabrication designed to give her an alibi while I died. She was close enough to finish the job herself. I leaned against the counter, faking a dizzy spell. I need to lie down, I whispered. Brandy smiled, a cold and predatory expression. She told me to go to sleep. As I disconnected, I saw the intruder's reflection in the dark oven glass. He was wearing a uniform from a local security company. It was the same company that monitored our neighborhood alarms. My brother Justin worked as their regional manager. The Betrayal now had a face and a badge. I looked at Camila, who was watching from the shadows of the dining room. She held up her small digital recorder. She had captured the entire conversation. But the intruder was now standing between us and the only unlocked door. I gripped the iron poker, my objective clear. I had to reach the laundry room to trigger the silent alarm. The security guard stood in the kitchen, blocking the path with predatory stillness. He didn't know I was sober or that Camila was recording every breath. I moved with a heavy, uncoordinated shuffle. The primary obstacle was his hand reaching for his radio. If he signaled Brandy, the game would end in blood. I felt the cold tile underfoot. The power balance shifted when Camila threw her stuffed bunny into the living room. The guard flinched, his head whipping toward the sound. I used that second of distraction to lunge into the laundry room. I slammed the heavy door and slid the bolt shut. My fingers fumbled for the keypad hidden behind the detergent. I entered the emergency code. The light didn't turn green. It flashed blue. Someone had changed the primary security protocols from the master account. I realized Brandy had anticipated this exact move. The silent alarm was no longer connected to the police. It was redirected to a private server. My heart sank as I heard the guard's shoulder hit the door. The wood groaned under the pressure. I looked at the small window above the dryer. It was too narrow for me, but perfect for Camila. I whispered for her to run to the neighbors. She nodded, her small face set in stone. She squeezed through the glass and vanished into the night. I stood alone in the dark room, listening to the splinters crack. The guard stopped hitting the door. Silence returned to the house, thick and suffocating. I heard a muffled voice from the other side. He was talking to Brandy on a headset. He said the target was cornered. I looked at the floor and saw a faint, white light. A laser pointer was dancing across my chest. The red dot came from the backyard, not the hallway. A second person was outside the house, aiming through the laundry room window. I hit the floor just as a suppressed shot shattered the glass above me. It wasn't a bullet. A small, pressurized dart hissed into the wall. It smelled like the bitter almonds from the coffee. Brandy wasn't waiting for the poison to work anymore. She was sending her hunters in to finish the job manually. I crawled toward the washer, reaching for the heavy wrench in the toolbox. The guard in the hallway began to pick the lock with a professional kit. I felt the vibration in the floorboards. My phone buzzed in my pocket one last time. It was a photo from an unknown number. It showed Camila standing in the driveway, surrounded by 3 men in black uniforms. They hadn't let her escape. She was holding her recorder like a shield. My breath hitched as I realized the scale of the trap. This wasn't just a murder. It was a coordinated abduction. The men in the photo weren't security guards. They wore the insignia of the private care facility Brandy had mentioned. The place where people go to be forgotten. My brother Justin was standing in the background of the image, his head buried in his hands. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the coward who provided the keys. I gripped the heavy iron wrench, my knuckles white in the shadows. My objective was to save Camila, but the hallway was a kill zone. I stood among the humming appliances, heart drumming against my ribs. The guard outside the door had stopped picking the lock. I heard the low, melodic whistle of a man who knew he had already won. The silence was heavier than the noise. I realized they weren't rushing in, because they wanted me to watch the phone screen. The primary obstacle was my own fear. I stared at the photo of Camila in the driveway, surrounded by the clinical uniforms of the facility. Justin looked like a ghost in the background. My brother's cowardice was a physical weight in the room. I had to move now, or lose her to the shadows forever. I grabbed a bottle of bleach from the shelf. My plan was desperate and messy. I needed a distraction to break the perimeter. I poured the liquid into the drain. I kicked the dryer's vent hose loose, letting the hot air fill the cramped room. The power balance shifted when I found my secondary phone tucked inside the toolbox. I hadn't used it in months. It was still logged into the neighborhood watch portal. I triggered a false fire alarm for the entire block. Every house on Oak Ridge Lane would start screaming in 60 seconds. The guard in the hall cursed. He hadn't expected the neighborhood to wake up. This was my only chance to strike. The siren from the street began to wail. A high-pitched shriek of digital panic. I heard the guards in the driveway shouting at each other. They were supposed to be invisible, but the alarm made them targets. I swung the wrench with everything I had. The laundry room door groaned and splintered. I burst into the hallway, eyes stinging from the bleach fumes I'd released. The guard was reaching for his belt. I didn't give him the chance to draw. I hit him low. He collapsed against the wall, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze. I didn't stop to finish the fight. I ran toward the front door, the fire poker still gripped in my left hand. The living room was bathed in the red pulse of the neighbor's security lights. I saw Brandy's reflection in the window. She wasn't in a hotel. She was sitting in a car parked right at the curb. Her face was pale and frantic. She was watching her alibi burn. The front door swung open, and I hit the cold night air. Justin stepped into my path, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of peace. I didn't slow down. I shoved him hard against the brick siding. "Where is she?" I screamed. He pointed toward the black van idling near the garage. The men in the uniforms were shoving Camila into the back. She was fighting, her small boots kicking against the sliding door. Her digital recorder was crushed on the asphalt nearby. I lunged toward the van, but a hand grabbed my hair from behind. It was the guard from the kitchen. He had recovered faster than I expected. He spun me around and slammed me into the wet grass. The mud was cold and tasted of iron. I saw Brandy step out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement. She looked disappointed. "You were always so stubborn, Angela," she said quietly. She held a syringe filled with clear, amber fluid. The men in the black uniforms ignored my struggle. They were professionals. They locked the van doors and began to back down the long driveway. My objective was slipping away into the dark. I bit the guard's hand, tasting salt and copper. He roared in pain and loosened his grip. I scrambled toward Brandy, reaching for the syringe. She stepped back, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp flick of terror. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the street. 3 police cruisers were sliding around the bend, their lights off. The neighborhood alarm had done more than wake the neighbors. It had alerted a patrol that was already in the area for a different call. Brandy tried to run back to the car. I grabbed her ankle and dragged her down into the dirt. We rolled in the grass, a tangle of limbs and suppressed rage. The syringe snapped between us. I felt a sting. The liquid burned against my palm, but I didn't let go. The police doors flew open and officers flooded the yard with high-powered beams. Justin was on his knees, sobbing. The black van was blocked by a cruiser at the end of the street. I looked at Brandy's face in the strobe light. She looked like a trapped animal. The twist came when the lead officer didn't head for the van. He walked straight to Brandy and handed her his cuffs. The lead officer ignored my bleeding hand and helped Brandy to her feet. My objective was to reach the van. But the scene was a chaotic blur of flashing blue. The primary obstacle was the officer's sudden, firm grip on my own shoulders. I screamed for Camila, pointing at the black vehicle idling near the curb. The officer didn't look. He shoved me toward the cruiser instead. Brandy adjusted her torn dress with a terrifying, serene smile. I realized then that the police weren't here to save us. The power balance shifted when Brandy pulled a badge from her pocket. She wasn't just a sister-in-law with gambling debts. She was a high-level administrator for the very state agency that handled elderly protection and conservatorships. She whispered something to the sergeant, and he nodded with professional deference. They were treating me like the erratic, poisoned victim she had spent months creating. I looked at Justin, who was now standing by the cruiser, nodding at the officers. My own brother was officially testifying against my sanity. I felt the cold snap of steel around my wrists. The sting on my palm from the broken syringe began to throb with a rhythmic, dull heat. I looked at the black van as the sliding door opened. Camila didn't look scared anymore. She looked dead. Her eyes were wide and glazed, reflecting the strobing emergency lights. They had already used a sedative on her. The men in black uniforms weren't kidnappers in the eyes of the law. They were transport specialists executing a legal, pre-signed emergency hold. Brandy walked over to me, her voice a soft, mocking purr that the officers couldn't hear. "I told you that you were sick, Angela. Now the world believes me." She leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive mint and malice. She reached into my pocket and pulled out my secondary phone. She dropped it onto the asphalt and crushed it under her heel. Every piece of digital evidence I had gathered was now shattered plastic. The neighborhood alarm finally cut out. leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise. The sergeant grabbed my arm to force me into the back seat. I kicked out, hitting the door frame, desperate to stay in the light. "Camila can talk," I roared, but my voice sounded thin and desperate. The sedative on my palm was starting to seep into my bloodstream. My vision blurred at the edges, turning the world into a smear of primary colors. I saw the van pull away, taking the only witness to my lucidity with it. I was being buried alive in broad daylight. Just as the door was about to close, a second car roared onto the lawn. It was Roger. He didn't stop for the police tape. He jumped out of his sedan, holding a thick manila folder above his head. He was shouting about toxicology results and illegal blood concentrations. The sergeant hesitated, his hand pausing on the cruiser door. Brandy's composure flickered for a single, glorious second. She tried to step between the doctor and the police. Her hands were shaking. She knew the medical truth was her only weakness. Roger shoved the papers into the sergeant's chest. "She's not crazy. She's being systematically poisoned with unprescribed benzodiazepines." "She's not crazy. She's being systematically poisoned with unprescribed benzodiazepines." The officer frowned, looking at the detailed lab reports with Roger's official medical seal. The mid-scene turn was a physical shift in the air. The other officers stopped moving. They looked from the doctor to the pristine Brandy, then back to my trembling frame. The legal certainty of the scene began to dissolve. The sergeant pulled his radio and ordered the black van to stop immediately at the end of the block. Brandy didn't scream or fight. She simply turned and walked toward her own car. She was going for the backup plan. One of the officers moved to block her path, but she produced a second set of papers. These were the forged paternity documents and a court order I hadn't seen. She claimed Camila was a flight risk and needed immediate intervention regardless of my health. The complexity of the lie was a labyrinth. I felt my head loll against the headrest. The world was spinning faster. I was losing consciousness. The sergeant looked at the lab results and then at me. He unlocked my handcuffs with a sharp click. "Get the medic over here," he barked. Roger was at my side in an instant, checking my pupils with a penlight. I grabbed his coat, pointing toward the van. "Get her," I whispered. My objective was back in sight, but my body was failing. I saw the van backing up toward the yard. Camila was slumped against the glass. The men in black were stepping out with their hands up. Everything seemed to be resolving until Justin spoke. He didn't look at the police. He looked at Brandy and pulled a small remote from his pocket. "I can't let you go to jail, Brandy," he said, his voice a hollow, broken shell. He pressed the button. A sharp, electrical pop echoed from the guest room upstairs. Smoke began to pour from the eaves of my house. He hadn't just helped her poison me. He had wired the house to burn. The evidence in the floorboards was about to become ash. The orange glow of the guest room fire reflected in Brandy's wide, terrified eyes. Smoke billowed from the roofline, thick and smelling of synthetic carpet and burning secrets. My objective was clear. I had to get Camila away from the van before the chaos swallowed us. The primary obstacle was the sedative racing through my veins. My legs felt like lead weights. Justin stood frozen with the remote. A man who had finally realized his cowardice had a body count. I lunged toward the black van as the fire department's sirens wailed in the distance. The driver scrambled out, distracted by the heat radiating from the house. I pulled the sliding door open and grabbed Camila. She was limp, her breathing shallow from the forced sleep. I dragged her onto the grass, just as the guest room window shattered from the pressure. Glass rained down like diamonds. I looked back at the burning structure. My history was turning into black ash. The power balance shifted when Camila's fingers twitched against my arm. She wasn't fully under. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on the blazing eaves. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, charred memory card. She had swapped the recorder's storage before the guards caught her. The truth wasn't in the floorboards anymore. It was in the palm of her hand. Brandy saw the movement and let out a guttural scream of pure, unadulterated desperation. The sergeant tackled Brandy before she could reach us. He had seen enough. The medical reports and Justin's arson were undeniable proof of a conspiracy. Officers swarmed the yard, pinning the transport team to the driveway. Roger knelt beside us, checking Camila's pulse with a steady hand. He whispered that she was going to be okay. I felt the cold night air fill my lungs. The lie that I, Angela, was a failing, broken woman died in that fire. Weeks later, the court stripped Brandy and Justin of every right they possessed. The DNA evidence and the recovered audio files sealed their fate in a silent room. I stood in the new apartment, watching Camila color at a small wooden desk. The house in Scarsdale was gone, but the silence had been replaced by her humming. She looked up and smiled, a real expression without a hint of fear. I finally understood that my worth wasn't tied to fixing them. Camila walked over and handed me a drawing of two people standing on a green hill. "We are safe now, Angela," she said. Her voice was steady and full of light. I realized the girl who saved my life was the only family I ever truly needed. We had found the truth in the wreckage of a burned-out legacy. I looked at the morning sun hitting the floorboards. The silence was over. But then, a familiar black SUV pulled up outside.